Our work plan is guided by 7 Alaskan commissioners. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our Village Infrastructure Protection Program. We help mitigate or respond to impacts to infrastructure in communities, and focused on coastal and riverine erosion, flooding, and permafrost degradation. And the boundary of our original VIP program was the GAO report 09551. And the whole point of this statewide threat assessment is to elaborate on that. We thought it was appropriate to put a picture of Denali on how big is this issue of environmental threats to communities. There were a few reports issued that tried to quantify the dollar cost of impacts, and we found it woefully inadequate. The ISA report stating $50 to $100 million per year to protect and relocate. I just want to share that we are looking into building a road for Shishmaref to their gravel quarry to build an additional road and begin to have a new town site, and that in itself was a $90 million estimate just to build a road to a gravel quarry. With the new threat assessment, we have between 30 to 40 Group 1 communities, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here we are with the statewide threat assessment. The idea was to update the 2009 Corps of Engineers baseline erosion assessment and to get a better understanding of the breadth of environmental threats to rural communities, including flooding and permafrost thaw. We wanted a better understanding of the relative risk among the communities and identify the highest risk communities and highlight that urgency for action. The final report was published last November, and we are looking for any input or comments on that final report in order to improve it in the future. But the purpose essentially was to establish the relative vulnerability of these rural communities, identify communities needing more evaluation, more data collection, and highlight that urgency for action. So we couldn't do it alone. We had some really great partnerships with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and they focused, UAF and the Cold Region Research Lab, CREL, focused on permafrost. They combined the scores and they did the final reporting. And the Corps of Engineers managed the flooding and the erosion data pieces. Now, our scoring methodology, we only utilized existing information. We adopted the scoring methodology developed in 2009 from the baseline erosion assessment by the Corps with some minor variances. We scored 9 criteria to establish a numerical impact score. Each criterion was multiplied by a weighting factor and then added together. The time to impact was the scores were multiplied by the time to impact score. Then we normalized the score, and we did this for each of the community. We did this for each community for each of the 3 threats, and we included uncertainty. The resulting products was a ranked list for each of the 3 threats and a combined threat list. We wanted to acknowledge the interaction between the threats, and then which resulted in groupings. And there was some distinction of natural breaks that were visually evident where one group ended and another began. But some of the listing and scoring could be easily, a community could be recategorized as a community into one group or another if it falls close to a breaking point with additional information. If they had additional data to add, it could change their grouping. So the data is available, the report is available on the Commission's website, and we have links to other websites with data tools referenced in the report. And the DCRA at the state has a really great statewide community database that some of the information is presented in. And I wanted to show this slide. This is one of the projects that we have done with our Village Infrastructure Protection Program. This is the updating the utilities with flexible service connections whenever this particular house was impacted by permafrost degradation, and with the freeze-thaw cycles, ANTHC, I believe, was able to put on flexible service connections for their water and sewer. But essentially, some of the takeaways from the statewide threat assessment: it does not identify which communities should receive funding, and it does not identify the strategy for reducing vulnerability. But there are some mitigation aspects that we can help communities implement. As far as the thawing permafrost aspect, the impacts are usually due to the infrastructure design. We have a lot of designs in rural Alaska that were not designed in Alaska or for Alaska. We just take, the design criteria for lower 48 building and bring them up here. And we're gradually getting better with those sort of things. We found that we can reduce impacts through initial engineering. This damage occurs over time, and with proper monitoring and timely repair, the cost of damage can usually be minimized. I want to highlight this picture on the right is of adjustable piling systems we were able to install. I believe this is an EEC, and that previous picture of the service connections, that is in Kayana. So this is adjustable pilings on the clinic in EEC, and Yukon Kuskokwim Health Corporation, YKHC, was able to go out and install adjustable pilings, I believe in 8 communities, to help level these clinic buildings. So takeaways. When we compare the core conclusions to our conclusions 10 years later, we still have the same data gaps. Communities need authoritative data, and we have some example scopes of work that we present in appendices B, C, and D to give a community the beginnings of a scope of work to collect additional data in regards to erosion, permafrost degradation, and flooding. I wanted to give the example using Shishmaref again. They had a resolution to relocate without an authoritative flood study, which could be used to determine whether protect in place solution is feasible and much less costly. I wanted to tell you just a few other little projects that we've been working on with the Village Infrastructure and Protection Program. One is the Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities, the CETC Grant Center, that provides technical assistance, and they help communities formalize their projects to address or mitigate threats. And then they also combine grant opportunities when possible. There's a lot of grant opportunities that require local match or, combined funding, and they're able to pick it, to look at the grant opportunities and try to put together a good package to end up funding projects. We also have a current coastal erosion impact analysis with the Alaska Department of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. They are doing coastline mapping, and with I believe it's a linear model to look at erosion, and its estimated time of impact to infrastructure in the communities, with the hopes of helping to find the locations that need the most immediate assistance. We've also helped communities with mitigation plans and response training, and we've done tabletop exercises. And what I mean by that is that we essentially had communities come into town, lined up their planning documents. We gave them some outlines on relocation steps. We gave them the catalog of federal programs and found that it was really difficult for a community to put a plan together on their own. And we're hoping that maybe we should do the same thing with agencies, and agencies could come and they could take a leading role in trying to coordinate and characterize efforts, understanding their own programs better, and being able to weave together a plan of action with the community's planning documents. And we did update the catalog of federal programs with the hope to make it a little more user-friendly. It essentially lists all the grant opportunities, and obviously it's a snapshot in time, and some grant opportunities come and some go, and new things pop up, but it is updated, I believe, as of 2018. And yes, and we have presented the threat assessment. We presented it in Anchorage and in Bethel, I believe in 2018, prior to finalizing in 2019. And we are interested in hearing additional thoughts and comments that would help us to improve the usefulness of the collected information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I guess we'll hold off on questions until the very end, maybe. We'll go ahead and let Erin share her presentation, and hopefully maybe if you have questions now, hold on to them, and maybe Erin will even answer them in her presentation.
We'll see. I'll try. So I'm Erin Trosham, and I'm going to talk more about the permafrost team that I worked on and a little bit about how we communicated some of the overall results. So I'm a geoscientist, and I have expertise in geospatial data science in particular, and I really like problems that focus on intersections between permafrost, hydrology, engineering, remote sensing, and decision making. And so one big thing that I want everyone to take home is that I was very much part of a larger team that included Billy Connor, Bill Schnabel, Mikhail Kanakivensky, Yuri Scher, Kevin Biela, Kelsey Dean, and Ariel Ellison. And so this was very much an effort led by INE and Corel, and then I was fortunate to be included as part of this team, which I really appreciated, especially as an early career researcher interested in this sort of activities. This is a great experience, and it's pretty personal to me too. I live on permafrost. My house is on permafrost just north of Fairbanks, and so although I don't live in a rural community in Alaska, I do have an understanding of what it's like to manage buildings for this sort of risk, and it is definitely challenging, and there's a lot of things that are not straightforward and they're not necessarily obvious. And so yeah, anyways, my deck was actually heaving over the past couple nights with the cold, and so we've been changing some of the footings and adjusting them. And so in order to start kind of at the end, but at the beginning, just so you know, I led building the permafrost data from this project into a new tool, and it's located at snap.uaf.edu/tools/permafrost. And so it's our new community permafrost data tool. And it takes all of the scores that came out of the first part of the statewide threat assessment for permafrost, and we've got a separate report on it, and it integrates it into a decision tool, essentially, to let you visualize the differences between communities. And so you can go onto this map here, and you can see what the different risk levels were. And then if you click on the community or you type in the name here, you can look and visualize how they compare against each other for these different categories. And so I'm going to go into this a little bit more as we go through the presentation. But just so you know, if you go down to the bottom of the screen, we give you lots of explanations of how we got to these scores and what they're based on. And like I said, I just wanted to highlight that I'm a postdoc here at the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center in SNAP. But this was very much a project led and supported obviously by IME, CREL, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and of course the Denali Commission. And so just to back it up a little bit more for especially the scientists that exist in this audience, I wrote about this as part of the search for Arctic Answers. I've got a nice policy brief on looking at effects of infrastructure on permafrost, mostly focused on Alaska. And so the big thing that I want you to pay attention to is that there's this nice building up here, and that infrastructure choices very much feed into ground conditions on permafrost. And that's something that if you understand how permafrost works from like an ecosystem and from a topography side, that when you put a building on top of it, a lot of those like natural cycles can very much change depending on what type of permafrost it is, what sort of terrain it is, how the building is designed, heat flow from the building, how water is getting routed, what snow looks like. And so this is a really key point to keep in mind right there. And so April Melvin did a great job summarizing what cumulative damages due to permafrost would be over that time period. And so we want to think about how that feeds back into the ground conditions, the climate data, and then into the design and usefulness ultimately of infrastructure in the Arctic, but especially in Alaska. And so so the two reports that we produced essentially are these bottom ones here. And so I'm just going to double check the chat. Oh, perfect. And so, yeah, so the first big report that came out for communities essentially and for looking at thaw settlement was done by Hong et al. In 2014. And so that was a really good regional assessment of thaw. And then in 2017, April Melvin's group published their report that looked at climate change impacts on infrastructure throughout Alaska, including permafrost. And then our work kind of fits onto these two. So the first two studies were regional studies, and that's useful. But I think, as Jocelyn pointed out, there's a real need to reduce it down to the community level and to understand that multiple levels of government exist in Alaska, and that although a community does function within a region, it also functions as a community. And so that's really where this project paved new ground, was that we looked at just the community level, so not at the very detailed building by building, but at that community level to evaluate permafrost risk. And then we included that permafrost risk in the combined totals. And so this is the first report and documents to do so. But I didn't include in here that there's been some really nice Arctic-wide efforts to do similar things, actually. And so I kind of excluded those from these. So on the permafrost side, what you can see if you're looking at the PDF is you'll see 3 different maps. And if you're looking at my online presentation, you'll see a GIF that shows you all 3 at once. And so essentially the big take-home message out of this is that 35 communities were classified in the high-risk group, 54 were classified in the moderate risk group, and 98 were classified in the low risk group. And if you take a look at the map, you can see that the communities towards the north tended to be higher. A lot of the communities towards the central part of the state tended to be more moderate. And of course, the communities that were outside of the permafrost zone were often low. So those are just some takeaways, but there's quite a bit of variation even regionally within these categories. And so this is something that I've been pursuing more work on, is to look at how the different communities vary and how they vary within each other and within areas. Because I think that there is obviously a lot more work to be done, and how communities are located and where they're located can be somewhat similar in a region, but it also can somewhat be different. And so that was something that introduced some challenges in doing this sort of study, is that why a community is located in a certain place can be for a number of reasons, and permafrost is often not one of the first things that's necessarily considered. And so the thing that I think a lot of people want to talk about here is, how did we get here? And so on our permafrost website and within our first report, we have a extensive documented system developed by Mikkel on how we came to some initial categorization for all of the communities. And so this is the data that's displayed in the permafrost community tools. And we then use that to inform a second classification that we did. And so these are very specific permafrost characteristics on massive ice, thaw susceptibility, if there is existing permafrost related problems, permafrost occurrence, permafrost temperature, and we summed all of these up to create a risk level based on the rating scores. And so, like I said, that tool exists so that you can go and you can explore and compare different communities and regions and have an idea of how the data breaks down, essentially. And so these communities were evaluated using a number of different sources, but since Jeff Curry is here, a big thing that we didn't know about, and Mikkel spent a lot of time going through, was the Alaska Department of Transportation, their geotechnical reports to get the first detailed community level survey of ice, ground ice, which was super critical. And then, of course, we used scientific literature. We used Vladimir's permafrost data and satellite and air photos, terrain maps, surficial geology maps, as much information as we could possibly get. And we tried to include everything. And so from there, we took that information and we had a big meeting back in 2018 about how we were going to take all of the information from flooding and from erosion and permafrost and combine it together in some sort of reasonable format. And so we went and we ended up reevaluating every community for both permafrost and for flooding, to build on the original baseline erosion criteria that they used. And so these had come out of the original erosion study, this idea of critical infrastructure, health and human safety, subsistence and shoreline use, all those different categories. And so we went and we redefined the criterion so we can consistently apply them for flooding and for permafrost threats across each community. And so these are very much qualitative categories, although they are well defined. And in order to do this exercise, we essentially sat in a small room for many days, and we would systematically go through community by community through each one of these categories. We would put all of the data that we had. We'd look at all the imagery that we had available. We'd look at our previous scores, and we just go through it. And then at the end, on the permafrost side, we went and we reconciled essentially the ratings that came out of this the scoring criteria against our first way that we did it with the permafrost. And so the ratings were consistent with each other. And so the big thing that I want you to take home from this, though, is that this example shows a multiplying effect of 3 here. And this was a big issue that we were dealing with when we were trying to come up with a combined score for all communities, is how do you treat erosion and flooding and permafrost together? And they're very, very different threats. And often you can have multiple ones in the same community, but how much risk do they actually present to a community? And so it was decided that permafrost, being a slow moving threat, would receive a time to damage multiplier of 1. Whereas you can see for erosion here, it had a time to damage multiplier of 3, and flooding had a time to damage multiplier of 2. And so this was our way of dealing with this really complex and serious issue. And so if I can suggest that you think about anything, coming up with new ways to consider these combined threats is something that from like a scientific and social science and also engineering perspective is super critical. And I think this presents a really good baseline for developing the idea a lot further. And so when I talk about these combined scores, this is what they look like. And so you can see they're all numbered on the map, and all the community names are up here. And so at the top is Shaktoolik. And just for example, one of the highest ranked communities for permafrost damage is Newtok. And when you look at these combined scores, it's number 7. And so it gets to this idea of, it's a terminology called USTIC, which is how is escalating feedback, and USTIC refers to the permafrost conditions. How could these threats compound each other and feed back into each other? And so, like I mentioned, this is definitely an area of pretty interesting research, I would say, from the science perspective and also from the application perspective. And so I guess I'm going to start wrapping it up here. So my suggestion when we're thinking about these things is that ultimately there's a tension, I guess, that exists, especially when you engage in projects like this, which is that they're very much focused at the community level. So this is where the effects are ultimately really found. And so when you're sitting there and you're evaluating every community has people living in it. This is where people raise children. This is where they have schools. This is their businesses. And it's really important not to forget about that. And so when we're thinking about these hazards, we're really thinking about them in terms of vulnerability and exposure. And we have varying amounts of data depending on the community that you're looking at. And then like I've mentioned, there's a lot of interactions to produce risk between vulnerability and exposure, but there's also a lot of interactions between risks. The challenge is, though, is that you're doing this for, in our case, 187 communities, and you want to be consistent about it. And so for all that there is very much this like understanding that we're evaluating each community, you also want to have as much consistency as possible at the statewide level. And so I think that that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is that how do we collect much better community information, which is obviously really critical, but also have that consistency to support the next Alaska-wide assessment. And so I think that this is a really great place to start talking about these things. And I'm really excited that a lot of the people showed up that did, because there's a lot of knowledge in this room about how to do this. And a big take-home thing that I can say is that when you're doing these like big assessment projects, that they don't produce new data per se. The data has to exist at the start of the project, and then the project's goal is to aggregate it and to analyze it and to disseminate it and to visualize it. And so these are very long-term, large efforts that take a lot of organization and thought to apply. And so on the permafrost side, some of the big recommendations is that we need to better understand what might happen in the future to engineer structures and how to adapt. And so the big take home that I can say on that from the analysis that I've been doing after the project finished up is that we really do need more information on engineered structures and which ones are failing. And in particular, we need to understand if it's cosmetic, if it's functional, or if it's structural failure. And so from that idea of what's happening now, really that's what we're interested in, then like projecting how that looks 10 to 50 years down in the future. And so in particular, we need more specific geotechnical data on how permafrost and infrastructure interact. And we need that to be collected using consistent methods and to go into databases that are readily searchable and can aggregate, like I said, these large amounts of data. And we also, like I mentioned, need better information on the timing, the type, location of infrastructure damage due to permafrost. And so, these are really complex issues. And so ultimately, when you're talking about infrastructure on permafrost, is that if it's poorly engineered, of course you're going to thaw the permafrost. In general, when you build infrastructure, you're probably going to thaw the permafrost. And so, and how that thaw occurs can be pretty complex, and it's difficult to mitigate for, and it's especially difficult to mitigate for when you may not understand the condition of the permafrost right now. And so it's a moving window problem of figuring out what you're doing, and then versus the state of the permafrost right now. My other big suggestion is that when you're presenting this sort of information, is that from a communication aspect, these are, like I said, really complicated subjects. And so it's really important to have a clear idea of what you're trying to say, to be making sure that you're visualizing it clearly and that you're providing opportunities for people to interact with the information that you're producing. And so that was my big motivation to lead the development of this community permafrost data tool as an important step to let people look at those intersections, especially as more data becomes available online. That's great and it's super important. And so, but it's equally important that we're building new and better data into these summary tools, which are readily digestible at many levels. And so I think that's a critical piece of information to keep in mind. And so, yeah, so I'm going to leave it open for questions and comments because I know that there will be some. And so, but for more information, you're more than welcome to contact me or any of the study authors, in particular, Billy Connor.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Jocelyn. That was very interesting. And I'm going to open it up for questions now. Miriam had to jump off, so I'm just going to help moderate the questions. If you have, if you're not able to speak, you can always type your questions in the chat. And with that, I will open the floor.
This is Kevin Schaefer at the NSITC. This is for both speakers. Both of you mentioned the need for data, and the first speaker talked about a data gap. And I was wondering if you could be a little more descriptive on exactly what kind of data are you looking for?
Do you want to start, Jocelyn, or do you want me to go?
Either way, we've tried to characterize some of the data needs by these scopes of work that Don Antropis put together, outlining, permafrost research studies, in addition to the other subject matters. But Erin might be able to give a better, more detailed explanation.
Yeah, so as part of the permafrost project, we actually had a survey that got sent out to try to get some feedback on what infrastructure was damaged at the community level. And while we had some participation with that, we didn't have full participation. And so that would be like a first thing that's definitely missing, is that we just don't know how much infrastructure is damaged and to what extent. And that's really critical before we even start talking about like what's coming in the future, is what's damaged now. And then once you know what's damaged, you can ask yourself a little bit why. And so we need more information on the actual infrastructure itself to try to get at some of that, because as Jocelyn pointed out, some of it is simply not designed for Arctic conditions, and that's a huge issue. And so regardless of what happens in the future, it's not going to adapt very well because it didn't adapt well in the first place. It's not resilient. So that's like our number one thing I think that we need. Number two is that we were definitely lacking, at least on the permafrost side, some information on ground ice. And ground ice can be really variable in the community. And so when you're seeing those summaries, that's a summary for an entire community, although it can exist on multiple different types of permafrost, and how that permafrost, the thaw settlement for those different types of permafrost can be really variable. And so those are two really obvious things that we're missing. And like I said, ideally they need to be consistent across a lot of communities, and so you can evaluate them more effectively. So I would say that, at least on the permafrost side, those are two big ones.
Well, when it's paused, I can say something. It's Vladimir. So it's kind of not exactly a question, but it is a question for everybody. I think it's very true what Erin just said about ice content and permafrost and inventory of already existing problems. But you also in your presentation said about the very important thing to kind of try to project what will happen to the infrastructure in the future. And for that, you definitely need, even you said that permafrost will be thawing anyway, but at least when, what's the rate of thawing, this kind of thing. So pretty much you need to know dynamics of permafrost under buildings. And this is a big problem, not because of the variety of the conditions, both natural conditions, permafrost conditions, and also type of infrastructure. Even in natural conditions, without any infrastructure, we have problem of this special variability of properties. But we kind of found some way to deal with that for very high resolution modeling. So based on landscape kind of types, and so we can classify the surface, and then from there going in very, very high resolution modeling in natural conditions. So my question to the engineering community, a problem is that each building is, well, for me as a geophysicist, it's individual impact on permafrost. If there any possibility to do some sort of classifying or not, well, like what we do with landscapes, can we do some classes of buildings and hope that if we will have knowledge about this particular class of infrastructure behavior, then we can extend this knowledge to all buildings of this class, of course, in different environmental conditions. So some sort of ecotype classification in the engineering side of the system. Is it possible even?
Well, and I was going to say, Vladimir, you bring up a really good point. And so one thing that we included in this report that was kind of included in that, like the first part of the assessment that we did, but when we revisited each community to reassess it and make it standard with the flooding and the erosion risk, one thing that we evaluated was whether or not communities have the ability to expand out of the hazard that we were considering. And so that's a really big challenge, is that like it was part of what was like qualitatively assessed. But I think what you're referring to would help show even more, which is that some communities, they're actually in the best place already to minimize a lot of the hazard risk, and where they could expand out to is not good. It can be actually much worse. And so making sure that information is A, available, and B, well communicated, I think is really critical.
I would add just a little bit that we do have some communities, and they have higher erosion and flooding threats, and they're looking for other locations to branch out into. And then we find those locations are high with permafrost issues, and they would have to change their entire way of building in order to expand their community into these areas. And it's kind of, which threat would you prefer to have to manage and mitigate? So it's not easy.
And I can add a little bit to this classification of engineering classification of type of buildings. It's also could help to collect right data and maybe use, and it's always limited. Possibility of collecting data is always limited. And I'm talking about temperature data, ground temperature data. Again, if there will be some sort of classification of buildings, we may save some efforts just to cover for each village some types, and hope that we can expand this knowledge to other buildings of the same type. So, well, I think it is possible. For example, roads, it will be one type of buildings which may maybe have similarly in different places. But the building itself, that's I don't have any knowledge about how these buildings can be classified. But I believe engineers can do it. Well, at least I hope. Thank you. And it will be very important for us to optimize our measuring or observing network. That's really needs to be done very soon.
This is Rick Mitchells. Is it okay if I mention a few oversight items?
Sure.
Sure. So I spend quite a bit of my time out in remote villages of Alaska doing geotechnical work. And the issue that Vladimir has brought up about collecting data is very high on my list of things to do. And what I've been advocating and what we've been successful in doing is working with the school, the science and teachers, and now the middle school ANSEP program. That once we get instrumentation put in for a structure, that they're able to monitor it, record it, and now with the internet connection backbone that's been put through most of the bush now, the data is actually very valuable and good, and it really serves multiple purposes. And I've been very happy with the response and return we've been getting, both at the school level with the students and the teachers, and also at the technical level when it comes back to our offices. So it's an area I think we may want to collaborate on, think a bit more, and maybe get in touch with the ANSEP folks and see if there's some synergies there.
This is Kevin Schaefer. I guess this is to you. What kind of instrumentation did you put on these buildings to monitor them?
Yeah, this is Richard. Most of them are antifreeze type piles, either driven or drill and slurry installations, some with and some without passive subgrade cooling. And instrumentation is almost exclusively beaded stream instrumentation. It's a local vendor up here that's doing digital temperature, and I think most folks up in Alaska are pretty familiar with them. And so it's easy to collect, very robust. It's been a successful practice for us. It's really augmented our expertise in working in these communities, because you get temperatures year round and you get students involved.
This is Kevin Schaefer again. I guess this is to Aaron. What is next on the agenda for the Denali Commission?
You're asking the wrong person. I think that's a Jocelyn question.
Oh,
Yeah.
I know it's like as part of this report, like I alluded, I'm following up with a paper that's coming that goes into more detail on the permafrost side and explores some of the intersections of that input data a lot more. So there is more information that can be gleaned from it for sure. I just didn't, I want, that's a we can have a whole separate discussion about that. This was a really good place to start with an overview. But in terms of what the Denali Commission is planning, I'll leave that to Jocelyn.
Now, Kevin, are you specifically towards village infrastructure protection or our whole focus of projects in Alaska? Or did you have?
Well, I think I'm working on some remote sensing tools that could help at the community level. But I just trying to get an idea of where, the commission's been in place for 20 years, and now it sounds like this is your second or third report. Are you going to go around and do more reports? You're going to set up infrastructure to help deal with the infrastructure?
Right. So we have found it to be very tricky and tricky to address all of the issues in rural Alaska regarding threats to infrastructure, and we just don't have the budget to tackle it 100%. We need other partners to dance in this arena, essentially. Our annual appropriation is $15 million, and we have to spread the peanut butter all over. So, our work plan addresses energy reliability and security, bulk fuel safety and security, the village infrastructure protection, transportation, sanitation, health facilities, housing, broadband, and workforce and economic development. So, unfortunately, our village infrastructure protection program, where I believe we have, I'm trying to think of the number of dollars that we have put into that program over the last 5 years. I think it's in the realm of $30 to $40 million. It has been scaled back a little bit in our 2020 work plan and our 2021 work plan, down to $1 million in 2020, and I believe $500,000 in 2021. So we are really leaning on our grant center to fill the void, and look at all these different grant opportunities and funding opportunities. It has been a very worthwhile investment, and we're in fact trying to stand up 2 other technical assistance training and technical assistance programs for our Department of Justice Victims of Crime initiative, and a Department of Energy Office of Indian Energy DOE OIE initiative technical assistance, where for a little bit of money we set up these grant centers and technical assistance centers, and they are able to help with finding all those other funding opportunities from the big agencies, the USDAs and the DOEs, and even HUD has imminent threat grants these days, and CRS. So that's really where we're focused on trying to get the most bang for our buck in depending on the grant center to help out with mitigating some of these issues. And I guess we take more of a holistic approach, where we may not be able to fund individual projects as much as we have in the past. And so we're looking at statewide assessments. We're considering doing a project to put to frame this bullseye around what data needs there are for each community, and basically a spreadsheet of what data has been collected for each community, what data is outstanding, and what agency can help that community collect that data, unless they're privately funding, but trying to get a list of where the data gaps are. That's a type of project that I'm looking into. Also, we're looking at refrigerated Thermo Siphons. We've had a number of really hot summers, and the passive Thermo Siphons that are keeping the ground frozen in some communities aren't keeping them as frozen as once before. And so we're looking to expand that refrigerated thermosiphon program, I believe through ANTHC. So does that answer your question?
Sounds like you're trying to spread a little bit of butter across a whole bunch of bread.
It's true. It is true. And our 2021 work plan, I believe, will be, I don't know if it's public comment currently or if that just ended. It will eventually be published in the Federal Register if anyone feels like commenting on it. We also have quarterly funders meetings with other agencies and funding institutions to essentially bring our list of projects that we've heard of that maybe we're unable to fully fund, but we're looking for other agency support. The Economic Development Administration, DOE, NRCS, HUD, EPA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Alaska Energy Authority, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, you know, a number of other entities, and they've been really great at finding solutions to little gaps. I don't know how much farther I should go into that subject, but it's been something very helpful to have the funding agencies come together and look at solutions, trying to solve problems of funding gaps for various programs.
Well, thank you both Erin and Jocelyn for presenting. We are a little bit over the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time, but it sounds like there were some good ideas generated for places where collaboration might be useful and helpful, and I will write those up in the notes and do what I can to follow up with people on those. And I encourage you to use any of the connections that you made here. Reach out to me if you need emails for people, and I will get them to you. And I also put in the chat box there a place where you can comment if you have questions or thoughts that occur to you later on this subject. We can keep the conversation going there. And if there are no more comments, I'll pause for a moment and then close the meeting. So any last thoughts?
Yeah. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. The recording will be available within the next couple of days.